Content warning. The Matherson Marriage contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and fictional domestic abuse. If you are in a real-life Matherson marriage, please reach out to the appropriate authorities for help. Resources you may find helpful include the Pixel Project's Domestic Violence Resource page and UN Women's International Helplines list. Resources will be linked in the video description for accessibility. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading from The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 6. In spite of strong protest, Pansy put Buster to bed early that night and went down to sit with her father. Mr. Tremaine had been a very fine-looking man, but there was a look of great feebleness about him now, as if he found the burden of life too much for him, and his hair was silvery white. "We shall have to pack you off for a long holiday, Daddy," Pansy said, perching herself on the arm of his chair and bending to kiss him. "You work too hard. It's time somebody else did a bit and gave you a rest." Mr. Tremaine smiled. Pansy was his favorite, and he was immensely proud of her, and of the success which people said she made of her life. But this evening there was a glint of anxiety in his eyes as he looked at her. "If you're going to worry about me," he said, "I shall feel I may return the compliment and worry about you." He took her hand. "Come now, I put you on the stool of confession. What is the matter, my dear?" "The matter?" Pansy repeated his words with a little gasp of dismay. "Gracious! Whatever could be the matter?" she asked. Mr. Tremaine shook his head. "You've altered since I saw you last," he said slowly. "You probably won't be flattered if I say that you look much older." Pansy gave a little exclamation. "You rude man!" She jumped up and went over to the looking-glass. "Have I got crow's feet?" she demanded with pretended fear. "Have I got any gray hairs? You couldn't wonder if I had. The life of Buster leads me, bless him." "It's not gray hair, nor crow's feet," Mr. Tremaine answered. "It's something in the expression of your eyes, Pansy. If I wasn't sure that it couldn't be, I should say you were not happy." Pansy laughed. "That's absurd," she said, "when I've got everything in the world a woman can want. Why, Violet admits that she envies me a dozen times a day." "Violet's a foolish child," her father answered quietly. "She talks a great deal of nonsense." He stretched out his hand. "Pansy, you would tell me if there was anything wrong," he appealed. "Plummetist!" Pansy came back and put her arms round his neck, standing so that he could not see her face. "Of course I would. You'd be the first of all to know. But there isn't anything, truly. I get fed up and worried sometimes. Everyone does, but—" She bent and kissed him again. "Now, what do you imagine could be the matter?" she demanded. He shook his head. "How can I say? It's only instinct that made me speak of it at all. But if you tell me I'm wrong, you are, absolutely." She moved over to the window. "How do you think Buster's looking?" "The picture of health. He'll grow into a fine man, Pansy, if you take care of him." "Basil says I spoil him." Mr. Tremaine smiled. "All mothers spoil their children," he said indulgently. "All fathers don't," Pansy broke in energetically, with sudden memory of the morning in the stables when Basil had boxed Buster's ears. Then she hastened to add, for fear her father should guess something from the tone of her voice, "I suppose it's a good thing, isn't it?" She opened the window and leaned on the sill, looking down into the garden. It was tangled and overgrown, and a great contrast in its wildness to the smooth lawns and neat flower beds at Green Gables. But a little feeling of love for its ill-kept condition stirred in Pansy's heart. She had known some happy days here before Basil came into her life. There in a corner stood the sweet briar bush, which she could remember seeing her mother plant from a tiny slip. There, over the rustic archway which Lynn Ramsden had built, and which was leaning all to one side now, a yellow Marshall Niel trailed in wild confusion, and at the far end of the garden the little summer house stood in picturesque neglect, where they had had many merry little tea parties. "Violet tells me you have seen Lynn Ramsden," Mr. Tremaine said suddenly. Pansy woke from her reverie with a start. "Yes. Wasn't it queer? I was so surprised. He seems to be quite a friend of Basil's," she answered. "I always liked him," her father said. "I suppose he is a fine-looking man now." "Yes." She wished he would drop the subject, but he went on interestedly. "And rich, Violet tells me." "Yes, he has bought Chiswell's. Basil and I went over there with him a few days ago. It's ever so nice." "It seems a long time ago since you made him so unhappy, poor boy," Mr. Tremaine said reflectively. Pansy bit her lip. He's got over it, anyway," she answered. There was a little silence, broken by Violet's cheery voice in the garden outside. "A penny for your thoughts, Pansy!" "Not worth it, my dear," Pansy answered briskly. She looked at her sister with faintly envious eyes. She was so young, so free, with all the world still before her. "You look like a princess," Violet said admiringly. She sat down on an old tree stump and looked at Pansy critically. "How much did that dress cost? 15 guineas? It isn't nearly so becoming as yours, anyway," Pansy answered. Violet said, "Pooh!" She glanced contemptuously at her blue linen. "Why, I made this old ring myself." You look a duck in it, anyway," Pansy said generously. She thought of Green Gables and her mini frocks with impatience. Once she had thought such things meant happiness. Now she was older and wiser, so much older, she felt, than her sister, and yet there was not quite 5 years between them. If only one could have the past back again, just a few years of it, how different things might be. "You look quite tragic," Violet said suddenly. "What are you thinking about?" Pansy turned from the window with a hard little laugh. "My sins, perhaps," she said, but remorse came to her when she went to bed that night. Buster lay beside her, a picture of beautiful health and innocence, and Pansy sat up in bed and cried with shame because of the many disloyal things she had thought. She was not fit to be Buster's mother. She felt that she ought to be ashamed to face the innocence of his eyes. She bent and kissed his chubby little fist that lay outside the quilt. "I'm going to begin all over again and be good," she whispered. She stayed with her father for a week. Basil wrote once or twice, generally on a postcard, and Joyce wrote every day. Pansy devoured Joyce's letters eagerly. She had a great mind for detail, and she omitted to tell Pansy very little of what happened at Green Gables during her absence. "Mr. Ramsden is here nearly every day," so she wrote once. "It's a pity he bought Chiswell's, I think. You might have taken him in as a paying guest. However, I like him, and we get on quite well. When are you coming home? I think we shall all be glad to see you." Basil wrote too, by the same post. If you come to stay on for another 2 or 3 days, Ramsden and I have business in your direction on Tuesday, and we'll call and fetch you home. I hope Violet is not spoiling Buster." Pansy answered by return. "I'm coming on Saturday, and anyway, we've got too much luggage for the car. I shall come by the usual train." She did not show her husband's letter to anyone, and when she had answered it, she tore it up. She felt angry because he had so persistently dragged Lynn into their lives. It seemed to her that he ought to have guessed something of the past, even while she was glad that he did not. When she wrote to Joy, she added in a postscript, "I wish Basil wouldn't fill the house with men. I shall discourage it severely when I come home." Then she sat staring before her, lost in thought. Did she want to go home? She could not make up her mind. She loved being with her father and sister, and yet she had not found the peace and restfulness for which she had hoped. The old turmoil still lived in her heart, the old dissatisfaction. Violet poked her head round the door. "Writing love letters?" she demanded saucily. She came and stood beside her sister. "Why doesn't Basil come over and fetch you in the car?" she asked. "I don't know." Well, why not ask him?" Violet pursued relentlessly. "He'd come if you asked him, and you might suggest that he bring Lynn. I'd like to see him again." Pansy did not answer, but her hand shook as she began to address an envelope. "I posted a letter to Basil just now," she said, "but I dare say I shall write again before we go." But she could not meet her sister's eyes, and her pulses were throbbing. Supposing Lynn came and saw Violet and fell in love with her! "I couldn't bear it. I just couldn't bear it," she told herself in despair. And yet she knew that some day, in all probability, a woman would come along and take the place in his life that might have been hers. Lynn was not the type of man to go single all his days because of a boyish fancy. "I shall have to go home on Saturday," she told her father that evening. He looked up from his book. "I'm sorry, my dear, we shall miss you. Will Basil come to fetch you?" I don't think so. No, I'm sure he won't. I expect he'll meet the train, though." She felt herself a hypocrite as she answered, and turned away to hide the betrayal which was in her eyes. So they went home on Saturday. Buster wailed and refused to be comforted. "Stay here," he insisted. "Stay with Aunt Vi." "What, and let poor Dodie go alone?" his mother asked. Buster nodded, though he would not commit himself in words, and when Pansy pretended to cry, he was all contrition instantly. "Don't cry, Dodie. Love you, he insisted, trying to pull her hands down from her face. Why don't you leave him with me for a few days? Violet asked. I'd look after him perfectly well. Pansy held Buster tightly to her. I couldn't spare him. He's all I've got in the world. Violet stared. I say, what price poor old Basil? She objected. Don't be silly, Pansy said. You know quite well what I mean. Violet did not answer for a moment. Then she asked, do all married people get fed up with each other sooner or later? Pansy flushed. What on earth do you mean? She demanded exasperatedly. Well, you don't seem very keen to go home. Violet defended herself. And I think it's queer of you to want to come away without Basil. Heavens! Haven't I been away without him before? Of course you have, and that's what seems funny. Violet insisted. If I was married, happily married, I should never want to be separated from my husband at all. Pansy laughed dryly. He'd soon get tired of you then, she said. She wanted to add a word of warning. She wanted to say, never marry a man unless you are sure, quite sure, that he's the right one. If you've got one single doubt, say no, 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 everlastingly no, no matter what happens. But she was afraid of Violet's keen eyes, so she laughed and turned the subject. Mind you take care of father, she impressed upon her sister when they parted. I can see he isn't really well, and he doesn't seem a bit anxious to go for a holiday. I shall come over again soon, or perhaps he'll come to us. I'll try and arrange it. And give my word to Lynn, was Violet's last word as the train steamed away. She was all roguish smiles. Tell him I'm very much like what you were 6 years ago, and if he likes to come and see me. The rest was lost as the train gathered speed. Very like what you were. The words hurt Pansy. She looked at herself in the narrow mirror on the carriage wall with searching eyes. Had she changed so much? Did Lynn think, as her father had, that she looked old and unhappy? Cows in a field, Buster announced excitedly from the window, and Pansy went back to him remorsefully. But her thoughts would keep wandering away, and several times Buster had to draw her attention to a thing more than once before she seemed to hear. Are you asleep, Dodie? He asked at last in a puzzled voice, and Pansy apologized and hugged him. I believe I was dreaming, Buster. Buster flattened a tiny forefinger on the window, which he had made all misty with his breath, as he called it. More cows and more fields, he announced. It was 4:30 when they arrived. Look out of the window for father, Pansy said as the train slowed down. He's sure to come and meet us. See if you can see him and wave your hand. She took down her suitcase from the rack. Is he there? She asked. Not nowhere, Buster answered solemnly. Pansy opened the door and was immediately pounced upon by an eager porter. Is Mr. Matherson here? She asked. I haven't seen him, madam. Pansy looked up and down the platform. There were only 2 or 3 people about, no sign of Basil. Perhaps he's outside with a car, she said. My trunk is in the van, if you will bring it. She turned away. Run on, Buster, and look for father. No, said Buster obstinately. Stay with Dodie. But he let go of her hand and ran on a few steps ahead when they reached the door that led into the street, and as she followed, Pansy heard a voice that sent the blood rushing to her cheeks in an uncontrollable torrent. Hello, Sonny boy! And Lynn Ramsden came towards her. And that is the end of Chapter 6 of The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you return soon for the next one. Bye!